Hi, this is Cecil Mummy. Welcome to Cecil's Corner.
Cecil, how's this past month been for you?
It's been really good. I've been getting in the swing of orchestra and chamber music and all. It's going well. We have a big orchestra program coming up on Monday, so definitely doing a lot of woodshedding. But
Okay.
yeah, it's been great. I'm really starting to feel like things are, systematic more so than just kind of sporadic.
Okay.
Which feels good.
So like the newness of being at conservatory is a little bit now becoming your normal routine in life.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you're getting adjusted.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's good. I was just going to ask you how the fall foliage is on the East Coast.
Oh, it's beautiful. So my family's from the East Coast, but I mean, a lot of people talk about the New England fall specifically, and I think it's very true. Like the leaves and the temperature, and it's beautiful. It's definitely, the weather is sporadic temperature-wise. Like one day it'll be like up in the high 70s, and then the next it'll be like the high 40s, 50s.
Yeah, so that's what we're going through right now too.
Is that? Yeah. So I'm
they're solidarity.
Yeah, I'm somewhat used to that. I mean, I think Minnesota is also so.
Yeah, I've just been seeing some friends who also live in Boston take such gorgeous photos of the fall.
Oh yeah,
and we are having a very beautifo fall here too.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I remember, maybe I'm misremembering this, but I think last year was a pretty gray fall, or there have been some grayer autumns in Minnesota recently, so that's good to hear.
That's true. Yeah. Actually, it's been pretty sunny, and it rained like one day this past week, but otherwise it's been kind of optimal. So Cecil, what did you want to talk with me about today?
So last week you mentioned a little bit about your practice routine and how you've sort of over the years built up this like efficiency in your practice. And I know that practice routines are like very personal for a lot of people.
Yes.
So I'm not going to ask necessarily like specific questions about your practice routine, but I'm curious to know, when did you feel like you kind of got a rhythm established for you personally? Like how long did that take? And did you recognize immediately when you got the rhythm down, or did it take self-reflection to kind of realize that?
Mm-hmm. I think it was around the time of my master's when I started to really feel like I could cut the fat, in that sense of what I was doing that was extraneous and maybe made me feel like I was working, in quotations, but it wasn't really actively helping my performance and accuracy. And I also want to say, so it was around my first master's I started kind of realizing that, but then I feel like I was honing in those qualities when I was at Rice. And I know particularly I attribute a lot of my practice technique to my teacher there, which is Norman Fisher. Not throwing any of my past teachers under the bus by any means, but Norman Fisher is just a very pragmatic, practical solution finder of problems, So when he would identify something, it would just be, why am I doing it this way? And then increasing my efficiency from there, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. And so it felt like in lessons you were learning, like would he give specifically practice technique suggestions in lessons, or was it more just like the way he approached giving suggestions was?
So this is where maybe I'm toggling between sort of those two revelations. Like by the time that I was in Norman's studio, I had a better sense of how to accomplish the fix. But I think other teachers in my past, in more the undergraduate to the first master's area, they were a little bit more like, now this is how you should practice, or that kind of thing. Or like, here's the template stencil of that. You should try it.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. So it was more so the way that Norman Fisher approached giving practical suggestions that helped you apply it in a different...
Yeah. And I do say, like, I feel like when I teach now, I feel like a lot of what I'm teaching is subtle practice strategies. I'll say, take it apart. Now identify the problem. So you're undershifting. So therefore, you need to relax your arm so you're not tense going up the fingerboard. And then from there, fixing that shift, then putting it back into context, and then putting it back into the musical gesture context. Those sorts of things. I feel like I do that a lot with my teaching, whether or not my students recognize that or not. Sometimes I'm like, this is how you should practice.
Right.
Like I'm just very direct.
So
Yeah.
I guess along that vein, do you feel like when you started teaching or coaching that your practice routine changed in any way? Or did it inform your practice technique at all?
Well, okay, I'll say a couple things about this because the answer is not the way I think that you're thinking it or you're asking. Like I had a previous mentor. He once told me that he feels like teaching makes him a worse musician. And I was like, great, thanks a lot.
Yeah, okay.
Like, excuse you. Okay, I'm sorry for your sacrifice.
Right.
I absolutely have the complete opposite approach and feeling about my teaching. I feel like by teaching others, it really makes me re-examine like how I got here. And a lot of times, if I'm struggling with a problem, I'll like think about what did I just tell my student to do and think about. Like, so one of my examples, let's say in shifting. For me as a cellist, maybe if I'm doing active performing and I'm in the moment, in the zone, I'm not necessarily thinking about how my thumb is integral to my accuracy in shifting. Just like the touch of feeling the distance from one place to the other and how the thumb is a counterweight to all the other weight that you're putting on with the fingers. And there's times where I kept playing things out of tune and then I was telling myself, think about your thumb. And then every time I thought about my thumb, it was in tune. And it's just like, what? You know, so stuff like that where it's like I'm significantly benefiting from my students and I hope they're benefiting from me. So it's not quite answering your question in that way, but it's really friendly reminders of, or maybe in a way, like, as I was saying, re-examining how I do things.
Right.
And why it works or what does or doesn't work.
Right. Going back to like the very sort of basic essentials of like, you know, how am I holding the instrument or whatever. Yeah. It all matters to no matter what level you're at.
And I remember another mentor of mine, Jean-Michel Fontenot, was saying that when I was his student, he was probably in his, I don't want to age him, but he was probably in his middle years or so. And he was saying, yeah, I'm constantly adjusting my technique. And I was like, wait, what? We have to do that?
It doesn't.
What do you mean?
I thought it was.
Wait, I thought we're. Yeah. I thought aren't we done? Like, haven't we figured it out? Wait, we mean we're evolving?
Right. Yeah.
Which is like, I'm just laughing because it's like, well, of course we're evolving. Like our body changes, right? And our relationship around the instrument changes. But it was just kind of my youth and ignorance in that sense of like, wait a second.
I thought I
worked so hard for this, but I have to change it later.
Right. Yeah. It's ever evolving, I guess. Yeah. Another thing I was thinking about in terms of practicing is sort of, you know, the relationship between musicality and physicality. And I think that the way that musicians approach creating a musical idea physically is something that I've been thinking about a lot because it's like, how do I get this big musical idea or feeling that I have in my head to directly translate to something that can be practically differentiated from the rest of the line or the phrase? And so I guess I would ask for you, like, what are your thoughts on that relationship between physicality and musicality and sort of how do you approach, or in your own work or in your own teaching, trying to get that across to a student?
Yeah. My immediate answer, I think, is half answering your question. So I will fill in the rest later. So this is kind of the more like surface answer, which is that in my experience, like you've seen me perform, right? People have commented all over my career about how they enjoy watching me perform because of the way I move. My dad even has always said to me, he loves watching me because maybe he doesn't know what's really going on, but he can tell that I'm committed. And he can tell that every motion I do has an intent behind it. It's not just flair for the sake of being theatrical. And I mean, that's thanks, Dad. But I've also been criticized for it. I've been criticized for moving too much. And people think that, or have said in master classes or, you know, studio classes or things like that, that they think that maybe by moving too much, it affects my technique, just the foundation of being able to execute.
Right.
So I've gone back and forth, and I've also watched some past videos of myself when I was at the peak of my physicality with my instrument. And I'm like, oh my God, that was like a lot. I was all over the map there.
Sure.
And I remember, like, I know that it was not, again, for any kind of theatrical, like trying to sell something that I didn't have any intent behind. I know every motion I was doing had a musical, like a very strong musical intent behind it, but I've gone back and forth. And in times I thought maybe it's better just be a little stiller and try to emote forward than it is to try to wrap around the colleagues I'm playing with. And certainly orchestral training is the former, where you need to sit still. A, because there's not a lot of space on stage to really go that way, but B, it's the idea that you are part of a bigger organism. And there's always been arguments about how sometimes people, have been critical of like the back of the stands second violinist, going to town with their motion and not conforming to the group. That kind of thing. So I'm not saying like, I don't know how I feel about that. That's just like the criticism that I've heard in the past from people, from audience members and things like that. But I say like, do you kind of thing. Like if you feel like this motion is helping the gesture of the music, go for it. I mean, I always call her Patty K, but Petrishka Kopinskaya is a famous example of a soloist that is, well, A, she performs barefoot, and B, she walks on stage and is all over the map. But I also agree, I think, with her that it's not for show. It's because she has such a deep, committed idea about the music that is so visceral to her that she must do these motions. So, like, that kind of answers, like, that first part that I was thinking of.
For sure. Yeah, for sure.
Right? The second part, I think I was touching a bit in my first answer, which is about technical things. So the other side of it is that I also hear the argument about my past critics saying I was moving too much and that I need to focus on being still for technical execution. And I think that that is true. And so there's times where you know when to be still and there's times you know when to flow. And I think that takes some kind of practice in a way of doing the performance practice in your room. And on stage, but right before you perform, you do runs of things. And you're doing them as a scan overall of how did the whole process go in this piece, right? It's not like you stop and fix. You're practicing them. Well, I was going to say you're practicing the mistakes, but like you're practicing with the intention that you're a fallible human and that you're going to make mistakes, right? That kind of thing. And so you're practicing how to overcome those mistakes mid-performance, right?
Right.
And sometimes that is, like I had a moment recently in a recording session where I did move and it did off-kilter my technique. I played out of tune or I baffled a bow, like a spiccato bow, because I had moved a specific way. So it's things like that where it's like, oh, okay, now I know I shouldn't do that in this moment. That kind of thing.
And I think too, something for me is when people would, because I mean, obviously a lot of people have given me similar critiques over the years.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of now getting to a mental place where it feels more freeing than restricting. I think it was like, I would kind of hear this critique of like, oh, you should be stiller here in order to facilitate a technical thing that you're struggling with. And my initial bodily reaction would be to get tense.
Right. Yeah.
But I'm just starting to kind of realize that it doesn't have to lead to tension. It can actually be a freeing thing to give yourself permission to kind of be calmer.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on that sort of phenomenon.
Well, you definitely pinged something in me of a yesterday revelation for myself, which is that, okay, yesterday this is like a snapshot into the life of a freelancer, right? And I was doing this with a couple other people, which is where we were doing the same gigs. And yesterday's gig, there was a morning dress rehearsal. Then we had a 30-minute window to be on time for another rehearsal of significance. And then we had about 30 minutes again to get to the performance of that dress rehearsal in the beginning. And like the logistics of the time going from one place to the other without traffic, without parking, without anything was like 15 to 20 minutes. Oh. So that left like a 10-minute window for anything to go wrong, right? Anyway, like one of my friends who was doing the same gigs with me was like, only in Minnesota can you kind of do this because of all these elements, right? But we also elected or got our partners to go be our Uber driver for the day. So that was like a very long day for me. And it was a lot of still playing because they're big orchestras that I was in. And you know me as a chamber musician, and you know me as I said, you've seen me perform. I like to be more fluid with my motions. And by the performance, my back, not my lower back, but like the middle part of my back, like between my shoulder blades, was getting like super tight. And I was just like trying everything I could to move my muscles to stretch on stage and like turn and do kind of the side twists just to like do spinal flexion, cat-cow, like in my chair. But it's like kind of awkward when, you're on stage, people are watching you do this. But like, I had to because I was getting so tired and tense.
Right.
And I was thinking, like, why is this happening where I've done so much chamber music where I don't feel this?
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, I think it's because I'm sitting very statically and I've had to be very static in my work. And I'm not saying like there's definitely moments that you can flow and move around as you're playing, but it's just my body wasn't adjusted to that yet. My body's still like kind of a chamber musician.
Right.
Where I feel the freedom to move. So anyway, going off of what you're saying, like being still doesn't have to translate to being static or tense. And so I think I'm trying to figure that out for myself too. Like how can I still have flexibility in my playing, even if I'm confined to a very small square footage around myself?
Right. And that's interesting too to obviously hear your like very practical perspective on that, because I think a lot of times it's kind of me in the practice room by myself trying to figure out, where do I move here? Or where is this like more like kind of a calculated thing? But then when I get to a rehearsal, I'm not necessarily thinking as much about like the actual decisions that I made in the practice room however many hours before, because of the sort of constraints of the contexts in which I'm playing. So it's kind of interesting to hear how the context can actually affect your physicality too.
Well, and that's a good point, and you're helping me come to further conclusions about why my back was hurting yesterday, which is that I also think it's the kind of playing that can affect that too. And this is where I remember a lot when I was in school, the like practice room sound. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Just in case audiences don't know what I mean, it's the sound that you can tell when a student or a player goes outside their practice room and they're playing as if they're playing in, I don't know, like a Wenger size room. It's like a very, like your bedroom basically size. And then usually the criticism that they'll get if they're performing in a studio class or a master class or something like that is you got to send your sound to the back of the hall.
Right, you got to play to the person in the back seats. Yeah.
Exactly, right. And so I think that and also playing, often I was kind of joking a little bit with a colleague of mine who also is a freelancer in the area about how I felt like one of the gigs that I was on was a full orchestra with singers who were mic'd, but yet the whole time the conductor is telling us to be quiet. And it's like, I mean, I'm not going to complain about getting work, but it's one of those gigs where it's like, is it better that I just airbow? Like that kind of thing. And so that kind of playing also makes it more static and confined in a way, like the practice room sound or that kind of playing too. So I wonder if that's why you don't think about the constraints of the room, because when you have a bigger space, your hearing reaches farther.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I certainly feel that too. Like, I this kind of leads into another topic that I was hoping to touch on. I've noticed, so my teacher's studio here is quite a bit bigger than the practice rooms that we're in. So kind of leading to the space thing. Yeah. So when I transfer something that I'm working on in the practice room to a studio class, all of a sudden I kind of feel exposed in a way, because the practice room, right, has this, like you were explaining, has this effect of, like, you feel almost like cuddled or sheltered in a way, like, which is a good thing when you're trying to woodshed. But at the same time, my question for you then leading into this is, when you're in the practice room, what are some good strategies that you found for simulating the relative feeling of isolation, if that makes sense, that you get when you're performing? Because I feel like oftentimes I'm in this situation where I'm in the practice room and I feel so comfortable and cozy. And then the second I'm kind of separated from the audience by this distance, it feels so much more daunting. So how are
this is an excellent question. Very good. I'm glad you're asking. This is how I would answer it. And it's something that I hate to say. For me, I think it's something you develop. It's a skill you develop. And it's something that also, as you were saying, kind of reminded me of what my pianist colleague was telling me about what it's like to play as a pianist. And so maybe I'll start with that. We were talking about how, at least as an instrumentalist, we can bring our own instrument. We know how it feels. We know exactly, and I was sort of explaining it because I had for a period of time gone to my college cello and was playing on it, and I was sort of criticizing, like, how in the world did I accomplish so much on this instrument when it was limiting me? I can tell it's limiting me now that I've hermit crabbed out of this instrument and into my current professional cello. So then she proceeded to explain to me, like, well, yeah, I mean, that's a lot of what it is to be a pianist. A lot of times the instrument is going to kind of fail you in that way. Unless you get like a Steinway D that's just so well maintained and, all that. But that's just like not your everyday scenario, especially even in a practice room, right? You're dealing with an instrument that is not yours ever. So her thing was saying that a lot of what pianists are doing in the practice room is imagining the sound that they're trying to get. And even if their instrument is failing them at getting to that, it's sort of like broadening that horizon a bit more than like literally what's happening in the moment. And so I thought, oh, that's really interesting, because I think that that's clearly they need to do that. And also I do feel like whenever I hung out with them, I feel like the way they think is very like that. It's very imaginative. But then I think it also transfers to instrumentalists in that there's times, as you were saying, when you're practicing and you're woodshedding, when literally you're doing the technical exercises to try to get things just right. And that's a kind of listening that you do need to completely zero in, and you want that practice room sound because you want to hear the nitty gritty and what it sounds like to you under your ear specifically. But then there's also levels of zooming out with our listening that have to also then say, okay, I'm going to listen not zeroed in focus, but I'm going to listen as if I'm pushing the sound out into a bigger space in a wider area. And I think that part takes a little more, I remember for me, it took more experience. And so I think that's kind of it. Since you're at school, and I used to do this often if I had time, I would try to sneak into the concert hall or recital hall, and I would try to practice there if I could. A lot of times it's like the trombonist or the trumpet that are there, and you're like, God dang it. But I kind of get it. I mean, can you imagine our struggles in a practice room and then think about a brass instrument?
Right. Now all of a sudden it's so stifled. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, I get it. But yeah, if you can either reserve, I don't know how the school works for you, but like reserve time, or just sneak in and off hours and see if you can just like get 20, 30 minutes in there. That's already going to help just like, you feel what that's like in a space that's much bigger. And, hopefully the acoustics are complementary. So
right. It's interesting too. Some of the practice rooms have the concert hall, recital hall settings. I don't know if you had that in your, yeah. So it's kind of interesting because I think people use that a lot, but it's still obviously not the same. It's just that it is interesting how obviously musicians are very concerned about sort of the context in which they're practicing versus where they're performing. That's something that I think is unique about going to a festival, for example, like Stringwood, or going to, whatever festival you go to where you play in a lot of different environments. Yeah. Oftentimes I get used to, I'm even starting to kind of get into this routine of like, I know what my teacher's studio is going to sound like when I'm playing Bach in studio class. Like, I know how much ring I kind of need to insert into it and what that kind of feeling.
Yes.
But when you don't know the space very well, you have to get acclimated very quickly. It's such a unique exercise especially for a string player. Because I feel like we're often so concerned about how much ring we're producing. I mean, obviously not exclusive to string playing, but it's uniquely present or pertinent, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess I would ask then too, what have kind of been some of your defining moments or moments in your sort of performing career that you could think of where something that you worked on in the practice room really felt like it clicked on stage? Like, do you have sort of distinct memories of that? Or when it has worked, what do you feel like you did in the practice room to make it really stick?
For whatever reason, my instinctive reaction comes up for me in chamber music settings.
Sure.
So that's where I was trying to analyze that a little bit. Like, why was it in chamber music that I feel like a lot of the things clicked? And I think it's slightly because, I'm trying to figure it out as I'm talking. So forgive some of the word vomit, but I think a little bit of it comes down to the teamwork and the feeling of not letting other people down. So things that I was working on with like a string quartet, let's say when I was in college or something, right? Yeah. I really wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to miss a shift and therefore kind of ruin the moment for everyone else. So I don't know what that says about me. But I think it's also like that's the negative side of it, but I think somewhat
Right.
of the positive side is that it was working towards a greater goal, and that it was recognizing that the greater goal was not to make sure I hit the shift because I wanted to play more fluidly. It was because I wanted to make an artistic statement with others. And so if I think about it in like a solo recital, for instance, it's similar because I'm collaborating with a pianist and I want to make sure that the both of us are making the musical statement together too. Or if I was playing Bach or Britten, I like a solo suite, I was thinking about the higher goal again. Like, what is Bach really trying to say in the Sarabande of the fifth suite? What is Britten really trying to say in the march of his first suite? And what sounds are they going for? So kind of a roundabout way of answering your question, but I think that it was when I started to realize that it wasn't trying to, forgive my language, but save my ass technique, but it was more the like, let's get to the higher point of why we're doing what we're doing. And with the net of let's not let my friends down in the process, who's also sharing the stage with me. Yeah. So there's not like, I can't right now pinpoint a memory where I really felt like I woodshedded something and then on stage it was solid. I'm sure it happened. I'm like forgetting that right now. Sure. Or like I nailed something in a way. But I think what I'm ultimately trying to answer is that what we're practicing is for consistency and for self-confidence. And so I often use those words when I'm teaching myself now. I'm like, you're building confidence. That's why we're doing this. Because, you kind of never know, like when you're on stage, you might be sick. For women, you might be on your period. You might have stubbed your toe. I don't know. Like, there's like a number of things that can possibly happen. But you're ingraining this feeling of confidence in the practice room that then you know that you can do given other circumstances, other things that are out of your control. Right?
Kind of that sense of like not practicing until you can do it right, practicing until you can't do it wrong. That kind of like thing. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. So I guess, do you feel like your sort of mental or practical approach to practice changes depending on sort of the collaborative situation then? Or do you feel like you would practice the same shift the same way like no matter what? You know what I mean? Like that kind of...
Well, yeah, I mean, a very practical answer is a fingering choice.
Sure.
Right? So if, I don't have an E string, so I must shift, but my violinist colleague does have an E string and could do a string crossing solution if we're doing the same shift, for instance, right? The same note shift. So like, yeah, there's times where it's sort of like that, where it's like, okay, well, maybe if you cross, then I can shift, and then won't be two slidey people.
Right, exactly, yeah.
But that's just a very practical kind of application answer to your question. I think a better way to answer, though, is that even now, like, that I'm starting to bring back some of my excerpts, orchestral excerpts, the way that I'm playing the excerpts is so different than when I was in school. Because when I was in school, I was trying to play like a cellist. But now I'm trying to play like I'm in the orchestra already. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Right? So like... Absolutely. I'm constantly thinking about what sounds are surrounding my sound. So it's like way more in that sense, kind of like chamber music. So like if I'm practicing a string quartet, I'm imagining what other parts are around me are doing. And there's a limit to that, especially in chamber music. The limit is it's your imagination, right? Increasing that imagination, but you do rehearse. And then you do have significant aha. So my imagination of this was totally off, and what it will be realistically will be this. And so some things get answered in the rehearsal process. But, for instance, like in an orchestral audition, let's say, unless you are actively in an orchestra already playing all the excerpts that you're possibly asked for on an audition, that's not really a so the imagination part, you can play with recordings. That's what I've been doing sometimes.
Right.
It's just to like get that sound. But we'll see. I don't know. I mean, I haven't had a successful orchestral audition in my life, so we'll see.
It is interesting though. I find, the difference between the chamber music and orchestral setting is obviously in an orchestra, unless it's a chamber orchestra, but you have the conductor who's done a lot of the work of what a chamber group would do together by themselves, which I think is interesting for me as I'm kind of thinking about, a conducting path is how do I balance between, as a conductor, you have to have a certain amount of authority in your decisions, but then also that difference between between the orchestral world and the chamber music world is really fascinating to me, especially when it comes to practicing. Because, I mean, you're talking about, like, practicing orchestral excerpts, which is, I feel, you know, different from practicing a chamber excerpt in that in a quartet, there's no one authority telling you this is how we play Haydn. You have to come to that yourselves.
Yeah.
So do you feel like the way that you prepare pre-first rehearsal in either setting, you know, pre-first rehearsal versus post 1 or 2 rehearsals when you're starting to get an interpretation developed, how do you feel like, if at all, your practice shifts?
Yeah.
When you're kind of getting insight, you know?
So when I first practice, I'm simply trying to map. If they gave me bowings, great. If they didn't, figuring out the bowings. Rarely do they give you fingerings. So a lot of times it's just mapping. Like, what is the best hand frame for this execution of this thing?
Right.
And combing through it, making sure that you are circling spots of scary rests or scary licks. And then you get into the first rehearsal and second rehearsal and you're decoding a lot of things. Like, so the timing of this is going to sound like this, or the interpretation is going to go in this direction. The phrasing is going to go this way. Okay, great. And this is where it might be slightly controversial, but I've also come to a point where I don't really do the second practice session on my own anymore. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. So this is where I was going to say, like, because I've done the grunt work at the beginning and then I'm just doing the practice with everyone else in the room.
Right.
Together.
Right.
To then get to the end result, because it is the collective that is getting to the performance. If I were to practice my music after second, third rehearsal, right, it's usually if I keep missing something that is just either very obvious or really vulnerable and scary. And those are just like bullet points. Like, okay, here. So it's a little bit more efficient in that sense, because then it's just like, okay, I gotta nail this run. I gotta nail that shift. This is a really horrible key to play in. How am I gonna make sure I play it in tune?
Right.
Like when I have 0 open strings. Yeah, stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting too, because I mean, a lot of times I think I'm too macro initially when I'm kind of getting a piece. And I mean, I guess it makes sense where I'm coming from in terms of like, you get a piece and you're like flipping through. I mean, I feel like this is a very youth orchestra thing, but it's like you get a piece and you see how many pages there are. You know what I mean? Like that kind of, you like look at it and you're like, okay, what's the hard spot? You know what I, like,
yeah.
And I mean, I know that it's not necessarily a bad thing to do and like professionals do it to a certain extent as well, but like, I do think it's interesting. I've noticed, you know, my evolution in a musical career is just like kind of having a little bit more patience with a newer piece. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So kind of along those lines, really diving in when I initially get it and mapping it out carefully is really helpful.
I'll tell you another story slightly. When I first went to San Francisco Conservatory of Music, I don't know if I auditioned for it, I can't remember, but they put me in the new music ensemble. The first piece was a piece by Kurt Rohde, and Axel Strauss was soloing. It was a violin concerto, and it was violin plus sort of mixed ensemble, 1 to a part. So it wasn't like a standard orchestra by any means, and it was like percussion and piano, viola, cello, 1 violin, that kind of thing. It's a cool piece now that I've played it, but when I first got there, I was so nervous. Like, I had to learn really quickly and also by a timeline of being presentable for Axel.
Right.
And I remember in like the first rehearsal, I was probably sight reading the music, and the conductor was like, kind of like, what are you doing? And I was like, oh my God. And so there was one recording that Axel did with a previous ensemble, and I just sat on Muni and I was score studying like nobody's business, because it wasn't just technically hard for me, it was rhythmically difficult to count. I wonder if I were to return to the piece, if I would still feel the same way, or maybe I just was not as comfortable back then with mixed meter and how to count things. But I just remember it being like, oh my God, how am I going to do this, right? So there's a lot of that I sometimes do too. And that was kind of what we've talked about, I think, in the past Cecil's Corner, that sometimes it's good to just have it as a passive practice when you're doing your chores, when you're commuting, when you're, things like that. And maybe when you're commuting, you're not looking at the score, please. Or I mean, if you're on the train, go for it. If you're driving, maybe not.
Yeah, maybe not. Yeah.
Sometimes it's just doing kind of that kitchen table work again. And then, ultimately by the end of that rotation of in that performance, I felt very comfortable with the piece.
Right. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense too. And I think a lot of what we have to do in practice is making sense of a piece. Not even just technically, but also like, why would a composer give me this? I mean, so
yes,
that's kind of a blunt way to put it, but you know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, I do know. Yeah.
Yeah.
For what?
Yeah.
Like, why did you do this?
I mean, a great example. So in the orchestral concert we're doing the Fountains of Rome, the Respighi. And there's a spot in it where he has this like really chaotic like 2/4 on top of 3/4 thing, and the violins are just like scrubbing this like insanity. I was sitting there looking at it, and we were doing it in sectionals, and you know, even Peter Zazowski, who's been, you know, in this for a long time, was like, you know, every time I look at this piece, I don't get it. Like, I don't, which I think is funny. But it just really made me think about, it's hard to practice something, I think, when you don't necessarily know the composer's intention. And I think the more that I score study, the more I get to realize, like, a lot of it is figuring out what is the purpose of practicing this anyway. I don't know if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I do. Yes, it does.
You're right.
Yeah. And that sometimes this isn't the case, but for most of the case, a composer's trying to tell a story.
Right.
And they're trying to do it with us instrumentalists. It's usually without words. So they're trying to tell an emotional story of some sort, or they're trying to convey like a specific emotion at one point. But that's a piece where it's like what they call a tone poem, right? Where it's an emotional block of sound.
Right.
And every little moment does have twists and turns, but it's just kind of like, there's a story, but this is kind of, Yeah.
It's interesting too. Professor Zazowski had us do all of these sections as like stand by stand, which was pretty. Oh
gosh.
And he was like, that was fun. But thankfully, he had like a lighthearted-ish attitude about it. I don't know. He wasn't so pleased, but we got it done. We got it learned. But I just found it interesting too, kind of going back to your point, always remembering that a composer is telling a story, and especially in a tone poem, they're telling a story. And I feel like oftentimes when I'm practicing or really woodshedding something, I can kind of remove that from it, and I'm just like trying to get the notes, and then I get into the rehearsal and I'm like, this means nothing to me anymore. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I do. And there's another example, well, I guess I'm going to say it publicly, but it's known in the business as you're faking, is the last couple pages of the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra in the string.
Sure.
It's a universal thing. It's like, it's not worth actually playing all the scales. I mean, it has been on excerpts lists occasionally, but the vast majority of string players kind of know that everyone's just kind of doing the gesture of the scale and not necessarily digitizing all notes.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, it's not the most important part of the overall music. However, that was supposedly the essence behind the beginning of Don Juan. And now everyone's like, 7 notes. You have to play those 7 notes so clearly. But that was not Strauss's intention at the beginning.
Right. So, right, exactly.
The irony is backwards there too, you know?
And even when you hear it, it's almost too clean or something. Yeah,
exactly. He wanted it to be kind of a shrum, that kind of sound, but then without it being just glisses, right? So anyway.
Right. Yeah. It is interesting. I mean, I always come back to like, in Fountains, like, why did he not just write, boo, boo, boo? He wrote every note out. So it feels like you're under all this pressure, but then you hear any recording and it's any professional orchestra is swallowed up completely. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I know. There's frustrating moments.
It's interesting, yeah.
Well, and also, I mean, I'll just say this one more thing too. I think John Williams's Harry Potter, is it? I forget which tune it is, if it's the Hedwig's theme or if there's something else. But
Hedwig's.
Thankfully, cellists, I've never seen it on a thing, but for violinists, it's become more and more of an excerpt because of pops. And, you know, the studio recording of the soundtrack, you know, they are playing the notes, but that generally would have been a sweep of sound too. But now it's becoming more and more like, okay, everyone's got to play the notes because it's so famous, right?
Right.
You know, that kind of thing.
Because
it's so recognizable.
Right. Because it's so famous. And I also think, I don't know, someone called it the nutcracker problem. It's like everyone neglects to practice the nutcracker because it's like, oh, it's the nutcracker. How bad could it be?
Yeah.
And then it's like, and then you remember, also, you know, that, oh, wait, there's actually a lot of gnarly little things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And also, like, people don't practice the nutcracker because they've probably played it like 400 times already before.
Right. Exactly.
I'm not particularly that musician yet, but I had a friend who was in the SF Ballet Orchestra.
Sure.
And on either the music or the folder, musicians had tallied the number of performances they've done of Nutcracker. Because they do it every year, right? You know, they do many shows of it too. Anyway, it's just
interesting.
And, slightly funny and slightly depressing. They're like, oh no, it's Nutcracker.
Nutcracker.
So
yay, I'm so excited. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for entertaining my practice questions. It's very helpful, as always.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Just make sure, for the audience, just make sure that for every hour you practice, take 10 minutes of rest time.
Yes.
And hydrate as you're practicing, and take mental breaks whenever you need one.
Yeah. I forget who was talking about. Someone was talking about mental injury comes before physical injury, which I think is kind of true in a lot of ways, right? Like the idea of like, you get to this point where in your head, you're kind of neglecting your well-being. You're neglecting your mental well-being. Now all of a sudden you're neglecting your physical well-being. Yeah, right. Not to end on a depressing note or anything, but.
I know. Sorry, just because it's so relatable.
Yeah, it is. No, and I'm glad too that the world, I was going to say the music industry, but like the world in general is kind of shifting to thinking about the relationship between physical and mental health. And yeah, I know we've touched on this a little bit in past episodes, but that definitely applies to the practice room, especially.
Yeah. Yay.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Cecil, so much.
Thank you. Please, if you want to hear more from me and from Patty, like and subscribe at Hidden Music Stand. Hidden Behind the Music Stand is available on all your favorite audio platforms. Please, if you have any ideas for possible themes or questions that could fit under possible themes, feel free to email me at cmummyviolin@gmail.com or DM me at CecilM10 on Instagram. Keep in touch and take care.